This is, as we've said, the fifth State of the Nation report. That means we've started 4 years ago, not 5 years ago, of course, but the intent of the State of the Nation report was to measure social progress and in some ways bring a balance to the media commentary which is dominated almost on a daily and hourly basis by what the markets are doing. And so our attempt is to say social issues are important, there are social indicators that should be talked about, and it's our attempt to do that here. We aim by doing that to try and identify some nation building themes which we might focus our policy advocacy work around. And so to us it's less about necessarily the detail but about the picture that the detail is starting to show us. And so for us it's important to think about where this is all taking us, to reflect on what's happened last year and the last 5 years as an indication of what we might do if we simply do nothing except what we've already done. And as in the past, we've focused on 5 policy themes: children, crime and punishment, work and income, social hazards and housing. And within that, we've got 21 indicators. And a couple of years ago, we brought out a report card format, and this year we've put grades in the report card. And so clearly, as a formal lecturer and offering grades, it's a highly subjective thing. It does depend on how good the handwriting was and whether or not the views of the student was similar to yours. But the reality is, while it's a subjective thing, we think it's within a point grade of being close to what it should be. So this presentation, I won't focus on the 21 indicators and sort of subject you to a very worthy but ritualised form of death by PowerPoint. Instead, what I'll do is talk about some stories, 5 short stories, which from all accounts aren't ending well or aren't proceeding well, but they offer us some milestones or some measuring points for thinking about our social progress as a nation. These stories seem to end in deficits, which may, I think, be symptomatic of a lack of imagination or a lack of compassion or a little understanding, as Campbell has indicated, of how the real world works for those who devise and decide policy. And for us, we want to try and say there is another real world out there, and it's important that you consider that. Now, the next slide, basically we're talking about our children here, and this table is in the report, and it measures various types or various measures of child poverty. And I just want to congratulate the author of this table, Brian Perry, who's over there from the Ministry of Social Development, and congratulate him both for the fact that he continues to do this work, and also I think we need to acknowledge the government for allowing it to happen. It's the previous government allowed this work to be published and to be done, and this government's doing the same. And I think it's important that in any democratic society that governments still allow work that might be critical of their policies to be done and published. And so I'm not claiming any credit for this, but I think it's very good work, and it does give us, albeit somewhat belatedly because of the delay in getting the data out, it gives us a snapshot of what's happening to the lives and the well-being of New Zealand's children. And regardless, there's a big long debate which could take all afternoon to talk about which is the most relevant threshold and whether we're measuring the right things, etc. But what I want to do now is just to focus on one of those thresholds, which is a commonly accepted one of 60% of median income based on some sort of constant value of that income sometime in the past, which at the moment is 2007. So let's just think about that threshold and see about who gets to be poor in New Zealand. Now this graph is this graph isn't in the report, but it certainly can be distilled from Brian's most recent report, and it shows basically if we use that threshold of poverty, that 60% of median income, we find that about 5% of households with 65-year-olds live below that threshold. There's something like 9% of couples without children who are under 65 live below that threshold. That around 15% of two-parent families with children live below that threshold, but then it jumps hugely to the experiences of those who are living on benefits. So solo parent families, 51% of them live below that threshold. So in other words, half of solo parent families are said to be living in relative poverty if you use that as a poverty indicator. And particularly if you look at children, and children in what we call workless households, that is a household without any form of other income other than a benefit, 59% of children living in those households are said to live in poverty. And while it's not an exact similar definition. We can see what's happening to those sorts of households and those children on a more regular basis by interrogating the data that's provided by MSD through benefits. And these are our assessments of that, and it may be subject to some question, but at best what we're trying to do is talk about trends. And so what we've done is made estimates of the number of children at any point in time who may be living in workless households. That is, those most likely to be living in the relative poverty that Brian's work has shown. And what we find here, of course, is, as you might expect, that during the economic boom, or what now was seen as an economic boom from up until 2007, that rates of poverty and indeed the extent to which children in those households was declining was improving. As employment prospects grew, more households got work. Those households managed to climb out of the sort of relative poverty simply by virtue of their working income and, of course, the very rich top-ups that the government gives through working for families. But since then, of course, there's been a reversal, and what we see, of course, is that it's climbed back up to where it was at around about 200,000 children living in such households, which is about 20% of all the children in New Zealand. And so when we talk about poverty rates, the figure of 20% is often a very common one. What I'd like to do is just sort of superimpose over that in perhaps a somewhat random way and say, well, what happened to the economy over that period of time? And these purple bars tell us what's happened to per capita GDP. One of the things that we often talk about is what's happened to GDP. But the reality is, of course, if there's more people to share that GDP, arguably we're no better off if our economy's only growing at the same rate as the population. In fact, if the economy grows at a slower rate than the population, you know, logically on a per capita basis, we're worse off. And these purple bars make an estimate of what that per capita income is, having taken account of inflation. So that's in dollars of today, more or less. What we see is that the per capita income is about $45,000 per person per year. And what we also see is that over the period of time it rose, and now it's fallen since 2008. And so that's the impact of the recession and very sluggish recovery. In fact, it's still falling. But if we take the frame slightly further back, we see that overall, as compared to say 2004, the average person, arguably, or the GDP at least per capita, has risen by $1,500. But over that same period, there's 7,000 more children living in these workless households. And so the question you've got to ask is, and I'll ask it towards the end of this, is what does that mean in terms of policy? That we go through part of an economic cycle, and yet there's more children, and we do have some small growth, but albeit that rates of poverty probably have increased slightly. Next slide. Next slide shows us a table that is in the report and it's been published regularly, and that is the notifications and the substantiations and the work of Child, Youth and Family. And what we see here, of course, is a significant increase, particularly in notifications, which stand at around about 150,000 per year. The substantiations are the bottom line, and there's about 22,000 cases where Child, Youth and Family deems that there was some level of abuse and neglect. That's 5% up on last year, but as you can see on the graph, it's significantly up on 5 years ago. So where do we stand in all this? What happened to trickle-down economics, and the story that economic growth would be the panacea for social need? Although these changes that I've described in that graph that compared GDP and child poverty rates only indicate some small changes, I think the trend is clear. Poverty rates change with the economic cycle, as we would expect, but there is no reason to believe that over the longer term poverty rates will improve unless there are some fundamental changes around how resources and opportunities are shared, and this might be particularly so for children. And I think at the moment we're also focusing on the vulnerability of children through the Green Paper, but the question we'd ask and have asked in the submissions that we're due to make to that process is that are we focusing too narrowly on vulnerability? We are defining vulnerable children as those who are likely to be hurt or neglected by their caregivers and parents, but should we be talking about vulnerability in terms of the adequacy of the income of the household, the safety of the neighbourhood those children grow up, the quality of the schools and early childhood education that they get to go to. And we think that possibly the focus on vulnerability has been far too narrow in the process to date. There's a report card which I won't go into, but as you can see there are various grades, and just for example, we suggest that God probably should get a C-, really could try harder type of thing, barely adequate. You're not going to be able to move on next year unless you pull your socks up type of thing. So, and some of the other grades, particularly down the bottom end, we think are quite encouraging, albeit sometimes off a low base. The next area is crime and punishment, and what I've got here are two figures which would appear in different graphs in the report. One is the rate of serious or violent crime, which is the orange line, and the green line is numbers of prisoners in prisons. And if you thought about causality, if you thought, well, how are these related? You'd think, for example, that serious crime, because it's increased lags out of prisoners, must be caused by increasing prison population. Of course, the two things aren't related at all, but one of the things that happened is, of course, in 2002, we had the introduction of the Sentencing Act, and what we saw after that is this explosion in prison numbers. It's tapered off a little bit recently, but there was this huge explosion where prison numbers probably went up by about 80% over about 5 years. And arguably that was deliberate, and that was a social experiment that the government of that time, and to a degree the government of today, chose to undertake. If the orange line shows what's happened as a result of reporting, I think, of domestic violence, and what you see is that there was a significant take-off of reported violence as a result, or at the same time as the launch of the It's Not OK campaign. And what I think should do is just actually unpick that, deconstruct it and say, what's caused this violent crime? And it's done in the report, and what we've said is, look, we don't really have a strong definition of domestic violence, but we know by the crime stats where crime occurs. And what you see here is the green area shows the increase in violent offences in dwellings over the period from 2001 to 2011, and the increase of violent offences elsewhere. And you can see quite graphically, I think, that the increase in violent crime is largely due to increased violence in homes. And I think any of us that have been working in domestic violence or in any type of community work knows that the most dangerous place in New Zealand is your home, and that you're most likely to be assaulted by someone you know, and fairly likely to be assaulted by somebody who's related to you somehow. And so the reality is that the story of violent crime in New Zealand is, I believe, particularly a story of domestic violence or family violence. The next slide shows what's happened, and this is one of those constancies. This is a rock that you can almost write a report around before you've seen the data, and I hope that changes. But these lines illustrate what's happened to re-imprisonment rates for prisoners who are released from prison. The blue line tells us what's happened to re-imprisonment rates over the last 8 years or so after 12 months of release, and the orange line after 24 months. And what you see is that they're fairly constant. That 35 to 39% of prisoners released from prison this year, somewhere between that, are likely to be back in prison within 2 years. And for us, that's discouraging. And it's clear evidence that prisons aren't a way to stop offending. If they were, you would see that rate coming down. And what we do report on in the report is the extent to which the government's trying to make a difference by resourcing the area of rehabilitation and reintegrations of prisoners more. There's a lot of talk about it, but most of the time the budgets don't change. And so one of the things you might say is, oh, it's all very well believing we can get better programs, but if we don't get better resource programs as well, we're not likely to make the quantum changes that we think are necessary here. And just moving forward, one of the things that's happened is, of course, the green line then illustrates what's happened to the prison population since 2002. And the blue line talks about what the Ministry of Justice thinks will happen to the prison population for the next 10 years or so. And what you see is this tapering off. They think it's plateaued. But Department of Corrections, at least some people in Department of Corrections, are still earnestly planning for bigger prisons because they believe we're going to have a bigger prison population. And so what we find is that there's a difference of about 2,000 prisoners in terms of what the Department of Corrections are planning for and what the Ministry of Justice are expecting. We think that's a critical public policy issue that should be discussed. So anyway, the rise and recent fall of serious or violent crime is we believe, a story of domestic violence. The causes of this recent decline in violent crime are unknown, and it's probably too early to suggest that we have turned a corner, especially around domestic violence. It's just 1 year doesn't make a trend. But I think it's important to appreciate that the public perception of violent crime might be based on a different understanding of that crime than the real one. And it's unfortunate that it's this perception that's guiding our public policy, not the reality of what's behind it. Which punishment path we're on over the next on now will be decided by the data over the next 1 or 2 years. And I think we need to look at that data, because I think it will be there'll be strong indicators of which way we're going. Crime rates are falling, but will our imprisonment rate match that fall, or will we simply continue to lock more people up because we can? Is it just because we've got a capacity to fill prisons that we'll find a reason to fill prisons? And that's going to be decided over the next year or so, I would suggest. And so regardless of the punishment path we're on, it seems likely that there'll be 9,000 people released from prisons this year, and that 3,500 of those people are likely to be back in prison within 2 years. That's almost a given, unless we start to radically change what happens to prisoners in prison. And the report card shows a couple of good solid Bs in terms of what's happening outside of prisons, but some fairly dismal grades about what's happening in prisons. And would suggest that is really an area of public policy that needs to be addressed. The next slide starts to talk about work and income and unemployment. And there I've suggested that, well, I've made the comment, unemployment is in the eye of the job holder. How we define unemployment depends very much on how you're placed in the labour market. If you think that everyone who's unemployed is lazy layabout, you'd say, well, I don't believe any of those figures, or at least most of them, and certainly the number of people on the dole, the green line, would probably be about all I'd accept as being unemployed. The purple line is what we call the official unemployment, and that's based on the Household Labour Force Survey, and it surveys people who are out of work but actively looking for it. And the orange line talks about the people who are workless, which includes the people in the purple line, but also what we might call the discouraged unemployed. And that is about 100,000 people. At the moment, there's 260,000 people defined as being workless in New Zealand. The next slide starts to show us what's happened in terms of total numbers of jobs over the last 5 years, and this is in the report. And what we find here is that there has been job growth since the recession. And one of the things that, and we say this in the report, we should be thankful that we're living in a country where there has been job growth, because in many countries that's not been the case. The recession has been quite mild to us relative to many other countries. And the reality is that over the period since the recession, there's been 20,000 jobs, albeit many of them part-time, created in the economy. But let's look at that slightly differently. If we say, look, what's happened to the working age population, and what's happened to the participation rates, because of course unemployment is decided in some respects by how many people choose to be in the labour market. New Zealand has a very high participation rate, but generally speaking it peaks and buoyant times and drops in times such as these, although it's still quite high. But if we apply the same participation rate that we had, say, in 2007 to the working age population that we've got now, we get a line such as that blue line. And what we find that in 2007, there were 120 people not in the labour market they really wanted to be, not in jobs they really wanted to be. And in 2011, there's 200,000 people. And that gap, that 80,000 gap, is what we would suggest is the jobs gap. That's the number of jobs that we need to have created in the economy in order to get back to the employment situation that we had before the recession. And we'll come back to that as an issue. The other thing is that there are probably two stories to be told, and this is the one that's certainly struck a degree of interest within the media. There's what's happening to people who are the retiring baby boomers such as Campbell Roberts, and there's what's happening to 15 to 19-year-old young people. And what you see here, and it was simply a coincidence that I got this data and thought about it and thought, oh gee, this will make a good graph. And it's in the Herald this morning as a result, but basically what you see is a mirror image almost, that over the last 5 years, rates of employment, or numbers of employment of the over 65s has increased by about 40,000. At the same time, the numbers of 15 to 19-year-olds employed has dropped by 40,000. So it's our suggestion that the young, particularly the 15 to 19-year-olds, have borne the brunt of this recession. So overall, we think the job story is credible, particularly given the global financial crisis. Official unemployment rates are not telling the whole story, we believe, especially for young people. there are 40 or 50,000 fewer young people in work today than there was in 2007, and that's a significant shift. To return to unemployment rates and participation rates as they were in 2007, 2008, we need a further 80 to 90,000 jobs in the economy. We think that should be the real welfare story, that we shouldn't be talking about welfare reform in terms of availability or eligibility benefits while we still have a deficit of 80,000 jobs. In terms of the report card, the character there doesn't look particularly impressed, and neither are we. Solid C's with a D for incomes and wages, which are largely remaining static. Social hazards. A number of years ago, a local policeman in South Auckland was asked about the pea epidemic, and he somewhat dismissively said, a pea epidemic? We have a woodies epidemic in South Auckland, and he spoke about the fact that the biggest problem with drug abuse was around booze. And he in particular identified woodies, which, as you probably know, are Woodstock, which are also made in South Auckland. And of course, it's a very popular drink with younger people. I can't stand it myself, but the reality is that it's very popular, getting more popular. And what this graph shows is the per capita availability of pure alcohol over the last 5 years. And you can see, although it's obviously because we haven't shortened the scale at the bottom to make certain that the changes are exaggerated, there really has been an increase over the last couple of years since 2009. And what that means is that there's been a 4% increase in the availability of alcohol between 2010 and 2011 to 1.2 million litres of pure alcohol. Translated into beverages, that is, obviously we don't all go around drinking pure alcohol, we tend to water it down with something like bourbon and Coke. The reality is that there has been a 10% increase in the total beverage volume of alcohol available, which is 7 million litres. Most of this increase in consumption is in RTDs, or ready-to-drink alco pops, and if you think about it, that is equivalent to 20 million woodies. 20 million more woodies have been consumed in New Zealand than the year before, last year and the year before. But beside that, well, there's no evidence yet that this additional drinking is causing problems, and so we're a bit more guarded in the grade we give it. Although, having said that, what we're observing is, for example, rates of drink driving convictions, which seem to be about the same as what they were before, and also, the reality is that things like offences by young people have dropped slightly, and we're not suggesting that somehow we've learned how to drink and we can hold our liquor like real men and women, real Kiwi men and women. The reality is too early to tell if that absorption of another 20 million litres of woodies is going to have an impact into our neighbourhoods over the next year, and we're suggesting it might. So in terms of the grades, alcohol's a bit disappointing. We think gambling's are doing well because it's falling. Class 4 gaming machines are still declining in numbers and losses, which we think is a good thing, although we do acknowledge that there are problems in many neighbourhoods around problem gambling. Now the last one is housing, and this is an Auckland story, so I see you're all going to sleep except the 3 native Aucklanders in the audience. We're suggesting that there is a significant growing housing shortage in Auckland. The report also identifies problems with housing pressure in places like, to a degree, Tauranga, Western Bay of Plenty, but certainly Hamilton, Palmerston North of all places, and Wellington. So, although with Palmerston North was suggested that perhaps people are going to Fielding. I've never been to Fielding, but I hear it's a great place. Anyone from Fielding? Has anyone got a joke about Fielding? Anyway, and what we see is that if in 2006 we had in Auckland at least 3 people per household, and what we're seeing now is that in actual fact, keep it going, next slide, over the last 5 years in Auckland we had, there were 115,000 additional people move in or were born in Auckland, yet just 22,000 consents were issued. Tauranga has a population of 115,000 people and has 44,000 dwellings. So we can see the extent of the shortage, of the looming housing shortage in Auckland. Each year in Auckland around 8,000 dwellings need to be built to cope with the population growth that generally comes about, but the current building rates are half this. And the shortfall in Auckland is, we believe, somewhere around about 16,000 houses over the last 5 years. One of the dynamics in the housing market which is a cause for some concern is the fact that rents have not really risen with house values. Rents have kept pace, and we identify that in the report, with wages and salaries, which really means that the returns that landlords are getting on rents are very low, and which suggests that there's not going to be any further investment in rental housing, which suggests there's going to be shortages in rental housing over the next few years, which suggests rents will rise, just on the basic logic of an economist. That may not happen, but it's difficult to see why it won't. And so overall, we think there's a solid F for failure in housing affordability, housing availability. Housing affordability is staying as much as where it is, and housing debt has improved. Now, I just want to leave you with some takeaways. Nowhere near as healthy a food as what was provided to us for lunch. And the idea with these takeaways is these are just figures that you can hold in your head, perhaps, and think about as you think about what we could do or against arguments that suggest we should do nothing. And those figures are these. The first one is, as I said, there's 200,000 children living in relative poverty. The second one is 3,500 prisoners released in 2012 are likely to be back in jail before 2014. We think that there's at least 80,000 jobs missing from the economy, and that before we have a welfare reform debate, we should be talking about how we're going to find those jobs in order to offer people opportunities. As well as 20 million woodies floating around somewhere, and they're probably going to float around again this year, which is a source of concern. And finally, there's 16,000 house shortage of houses in Auckland. So those are just the takeaways I want to leave with you.